welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On this week's episode of Horns, we reach into the Wayback Machine to go to October 2022 for a discussion held at the Clements Center at the University of Texas Austin between Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center and Editor-in-Chief of Texas National Security Review, and Professor Hal Brands, Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Brands discusses with Inboden his book, co-authored with Michael Beckley, Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China. This week, as America deals with the aftermath of a Chinese surveillance balloon and revelations about an extensive Chinese aerial surveillance program that has often violated U.S. territorial airspace, it's interesting to take a look at Brand's argument, which blends nuance and things that are often associated with alarmism, as it discusses the impact of China's growing and soon-to-be shrinking economic and military power. Brands and Beckley argue that it is not rising powers that pose the greatest threat, but, as he phrases it, peaking powers. As he identifies the multiple factors that suggest that China may be approaching a peak, at least temporarily, in its economic and military power, he forecasts the dangers that may exist in this superpower competition. This is an interesting, nuanced, and well-informed discussion that will help to shed the events of the current week in a different and perhaps more sober light. Let's listen in.
This book is a little bit of a pushback against what, for a number of years, I think was the conventional wisdom about the U.S.-China relationship, which is that China was the next global superpower. It was going to displace the United States atop the standings of the world's greatest powers. And it was sort of going to effortlessly zip past into the top spot. We think this is wrong. We think that China is not going to overtake the United States as the world's greatest power, not by a long shot, and that it's actually wrong to think about China as this continually rising power. China is better thought of as a peaking power, and for precisely that reason, it's actually a particularly dangerous power. And so it's important to note here what we're not saying. China's rise is clearly quite real. It has experienced historic growth over the last 4 decades and change, which has enabled a dramatic expansion of its global influence, one of the largest peacetime military buildups in modern history, if not all of history. And this has allowed China to increasingly articulate some very big ambitions. I mean, everything from the basics, which is to maintain the CCP's hold on the political system indefinitely, to sort of putting together the greater China that Xi Jinping has on his map, which would encompass Taiwan and Hong Kong and then a big chunk of area that's claimed by India and large swaths of the South China Sea and East China Sea, to becoming the primary power in the Asia Pacific, which requires kicking the United States to the sidelines, and ultimately becoming the leading power in the international system. The challenge is that it's going to be increasingly difficult for China to achieve these ambitions peacefully because it's running into greater problems at home and abroad. It's really increasingly looking at a future of economic stagnation as the result of a variety of factors, from a coming demographic implosion to the stalling of the economic reform program to an increasingly repressive and brittle political system to the exhaustion of many of China's natural resources. It's also looking at a future of strategic competition and strategic encirclement as more and more countries, particularly but not solely advanced democracies, and especially the United States, come to identify China as their primary competitor and start taking steps to offset and balance its power. And so pretty much wherever you look these days, there are U.S. policies or multilateral arrangements that either implicitly or explicitly are about checking China's power and constraining its ability to disrupt the U.S.-led international system. And so look at the Quad or AUKUS or a variety of other things that have taken shape over the last half-decade or so. And so the bottom line is that China has big ambitions, but it's going to have real trouble achieving them peacefully. And this has historically been a very dangerous combination. And so when you think about revisionist powers, so that's just a term for countries that wish the international system worked differently than it did, right? They want a bigger share of the goodies internationally. Those countries tend to become most aggressive and dangerous, not when they are rising confidently into the future, but when their power peaks and they start to decline. That's when they become more willing to take bigger risks, to lock in gains while they still can, even if that requires using force to do so. And so there's a fair amount of history in the book that goes through how this is a good way of looking at the dilemma that Germany faced in the run-up to World War I, or that Japan faced in the run-up to World War II. You can actually argue that two of the greatest wars of the modern era were started not by rising powers, but by powers that had peaked and were starting to decline. And this is precisely what we should worry about with respect to China today, because the reality is that decline or peaking, the peaking phenomenon doesn't happen in all dimensions at once. Countries can start growing explosively economically long before they develop the military capabilities to match. They can keep pouring money into their military even after their economy has started to stagnate. This is what the Soviet Union did in the 1970s, for instance. And while China is looking at a pretty nasty economic and strategic future as it gets into the 2030s, it's going to enjoy a pretty tempting window of military opportunity in the late 2020s as a result of its buildup and as a result of the fact that the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and other countries have been slow to respond to this challenge and still aren't moving with the appropriate degree of urgency today. And so the basic message of the book is that, yes, you can think about the U.S.-China relationship as a superpower marathon or whatever metaphor you like, but to extend that metaphor a little bit further, just to get to the marathon, first you have to win a decade-long sprint, because the coming decade, the current decade, I should say, is really going to be the most dangerous part of the U.S.-China competition, when the risk of military conflict is highest and tensions are likely to be quite severe. And so that's essentially the argument we make.
All right. So let's dive into that a little bit. And I want to start by reading a brief excerpt from the very beginning of the book, and then talk about why you started this way. So turn with me, if you will, class, to the very first page of the book. All right, you don't have to. Okay. It is January 18th, 2025, and a war is about to start. The U.S. presidential inauguration is only 2 days away, but the election results remain contested. Both the Democratic and Republican candidates are claiming victory and preparing to take the oath of office, while millions of their supporters clash in the streets. It is America's second straight disputed election, this time accompanied by a crisis on the other side of the world. We flip forward 2 pages later. There's only one sure way to stop the invasion: strike Chinese forces with low-yield nuclear weapons as they load in mainland ports and airfields. America is still the stronger power, President Biden's advisors tell him. It can win a big war if it throws everything it has into the fight. But such a conflict might end up destroying Taiwan in order to save it, and prove disastrous for America and China alike. So, Professor Brands, that is a very provocative way to start a book, especially, most of your previous works, it's safe to say, are history books, right? Writing about what actually has happened in the past. Tell us a little bit about why you and Mike Beckley decided to start the book that way, with this very gripping and terrifying fictional future scenario.
Well, I think what we wanted to do is kind of grab the reader by the lapels and really, shake the reader a little bit as a way of illustrating what the stakes of this are and what the cost potentially getting it wrong could be. And so there has been, over the past 4, 5, 6 years, I think, an emerging consensus in Washington that the United States is engaged in strategic competition, geopolitical competition, rivalry, whatever you want to call it, with China. But I think what we've only started to realize, in some cases in the past 2 months since the Pelosi visit to Taiwan and the crisis that led to, or perhaps over the past year and a half or so, is that when we talk about great power competition, we're actually talking about something that comes with the real risk of great power war, of no kidding high-intensity military conflict between the two most powerful countries in the international system. And because it has been so long since this happened, right? It's been since 1945 that you had sort of a so-called hegemonic war in the international system. We have probably forgotten exactly what that would entail and how awful it would be, right? And if there was a U.S.-China conflict, it would be the most awful thing the world has experienced in decades. It would be awful from a humanitarian perspective. It would be awful from an economic perspective. It would make the economic disruption that the Ukraine war has caused look trivial by comparison. If you just think of the way that a U.S.-China war would disrupt major trade routes in East Asia, the way it would rip apart technological supply chains that the world relies on. And of course, it would come with a significant danger of nuclear escalation, because you're talking about two mature nuclear powers that both have very important interests at stake in this competition, or in this conflict. And so the point I think that we're trying to make in the book is that the price of getting this wrong isn't sort of some abstract disadvantage in a predominantly peaceful competition with China. It could be a really gruesome military conflict. And so that's why we started there.
Yeah, all right. Like I said, it certainly is arresting. So your most recent book before this one that came out less than a year ago, just earlier this year, was the Twilight Struggle, and framed around winning the United States preparing itself to win a long-term great power competition. But you very explicitly, and you talked about this in your introductory remarks, and you very explicitly state in this book, Americans urgently need to start seeing the Sino-American rivalry less as a 100-year marathon and more as a blistering decade-long sprint. Now, don't worry, this is not an obnoxious gotcha question. You talk in the book about balancing both the urgent crisis facing us now and the longer-term competition. In some ways, we can see your most recent book and this one is somewhat complementary. But unpack that for us a little bit more, where you're trying to create both a sense of urgency among Americans for this near-term crisis, but also prepare us for still that 50, 100-year-long marathon. How can we think that through?
So I think it's quite likely that the U.S.-China rivalry will be protracted, right? Because I think that its causes are pretty deeply rooted. They are geopolitical and ideological. And even if we're right in this book that China's power is peaking, that doesn't mean that China is going to cease being an international problem for the United States a decade from now. It's likely going to continue to be a competitor for decades to come. And so it's not wrong to see the U.S.-China competition as something that might last a generation or longer. But the point that I think you'll appreciate as another historian of the Cold War is that not all parts of a long competition are created equal, right? And so you can have parts of the Cold War that were more dangerous, parts of the Cold War that were less dangerous, right? Parts where the pace of the rivalry is torrid, parts where the pace of the rivalry is more relaxed. And so the point we're trying to make here is that even if this is a long competition, we have to think about the coming decade as the most critical moment in that competition. And there is sort of a Cold War parallel here, where I think most people would look back and say, the most dangerous period of the Cold War was the period between the late 1940s and at most kind of the early 1960s, right? That's when you have the most intense phase of the competition. It's when the danger of war is most real. It's when there are high stakes crises in a number of places. And it wasn't
multiple Berlin crises, Cuban Missile Crisis,
the Cuban crisis,
invasion
right?
of Hungary.
Korean War, right, and all the escalatory dynamics that were in play there. And it wasn't that the Cold War was over after that, right? I mean, the United States had another quarter century of competition ahead of it, but there was much less of a danger after that point that the United States might decisively lose the Cold War, even though the danger didn't disappear altogether. And I would say that while the risk of war was still higher than anyone would be comfortable with, including at some times that you've written about where tensions were very high in the early 1980s, it was almost certainly less than it had been in 1948 or 1958 or 1962. And so the idea here is that if you can get through the danger zone, it's not that you've won and everything is great, but hopefully you get into a phase of the competition that is a bit more manageable over time.
Oh, all right. So let's pivot and probe a little bit more on your analysis of China. Let's call it your net assessment of China. And you and I have, together done some work for the Pentagon. Actually has an office of net assessment, which is supposed to essentially account for all the relevant factors in an area of concern or threat, and what they all net out. Because you're trying to make a somewhat subtle argument here about China is really strong and really weak at the same time. And you and I both know that that's actually quite possible for something to be that. But for, I think, average Americans trying to figure out what are we supposed to make of China and how do we as a country respond to this? I don't know that your subtitle consciously paralleled this, but a number of years ago, Gordon Chang had that more alarmist, The Coming Collapse of China book, and which hasn't quite happened yet. So rack and stack it for us. Tell us kind of the tabulation of China's strengths, and then also China's weaknesses and liabilities and how they fit together in this combustible mix.
Sure. And just to be very clear, we are not predicting the collapse of the Chinese system, right? We are not predicting that China is going to fall off an economic cliff. We are not predicting that The rule of the CCP is going to come to an end. All of these things may happen, but that's not the argument that we're making. So when you think about kind of strengths and weaknesses, the first place to start is with the fact that China's aggregate national power is just dramatically higher now than it was, let's say, 45 years ago when the reform and opening period began after Mao's death. And so as late as the end of the Cold War, I think China accounted for about 1.5 or 2% of global GDP, right? It's nearly an order of magnitude greater now. The joke back in the mid-1990s when we had sort of the last Taiwan Strait crisis before this one was that it would take a 1,000,000-man swim for the PLA to reach Taiwan. It was not particularly a technologically sophisticated force. It was still rooted in a lot of Maoist concepts from the 1950s and 1960s. Obviously, that's changed today as well. And so the PLA has become a major competitor to the United States in the Western Pacific, depending on who you ask. It may even be able to defeat the United States military in a contest over Taiwan, for instance, where the PLA's geographic advantages would be at their greatest. And it's increasingly becoming a global military rival to the United States. If you look at the way that China's developing a military basing footprint beyond its immediate periphery, or the construction of a blue water navy that can obviously reach out well beyond the Western Pacific, or the development of nuclear capabilities that are clearly meant to make China appear to the United States at some point in the next decade. And so China has become, it's not so much a rising power, it's a risen power. China is a great power in its own right at this point. And so that's the baseline we have to start from. So in terms of kind of strengths and weaknesses within that context, I think China faces kind of two big categories of weaknesses. And so the first category of weaknesses would be things that are going to slow down the Chinese economy in the coming decade and beyond, and in fact already have slowed down the Chinese economy. And so just as a point of reference, China's growth rate coming into the Great Recession in 2008, 2009 was between 13 and 15%. Even before COVID, it was around 6%. And that's looking at the official statistics, right? And so there's kind of, lies, damn lies, and then Chinese government statistics, right?
Yeah.
And so
if you torture statistics long enough, they'll confess to anything.
And so, it's very hard to know what China's actual growth rate is, in part because the statistics are massaged, in part because the CCP has long pursued a growth model that kind of involves like brute force feeding capital into the economy to gin up more production, but is that productive production or unproductive production, right? There's a whole debate over that. But the basic fact of the matter is that China was already looking at dramatically lower economic growth in, say, the 2020s than in the 2000s or even the 2010s, and COVID has only made it worse. But COVID is an acute factor. There are other kind of more persistent factors driving this slowdown as well. And so one of them is that China has become increasingly resource dependent. And so when the reform and opening period started, China was largely self-sufficient in a lot of the resources it needed for growth. That is no longer the case. China is running out of arable land. It's running out of water that can be used for sort of industrial and agricultural purposes, let alone for human consumption. It is deeply energy dependent on imports from the Persian Gulf and so on and so forth. There is a looming demographic problem, and so China has a demographic problem that will make ours look very minor by comparison. According to some estimates, China's population at the end of this century will be half what it is today. That's the legacy of the one-child policy. Even in the next 10 to 15 years, it's going to be adding lots and lots of senior citizens and losing lots and lots of working-age individuals, which is never good for economic growth. The economic reform program has really been mostly defunct since kind of the late 2000s. And so China is no longer going down the path of economic liberalization that had helped to spur a lot of that early growth in, say, the 2 or 3 decades after Mao's death. And the political system is becoming less and less conducive to economic growth as well. And so you see case after case where Xi Jinping is prioritizing political control, even his personal political control within China over the imperatives of economic growth, whether that's sort of nuking large swaths of the Chinese tech sector a year ago, imposing increasingly politically driven restrictions on the number of hours of video games you can play in a week and things of that nature. It's increasingly reverting to an economy where political dictates trump economic dictates. And then the last factor I just mentioned here is that one of the biggest things that helped China grow so explosively from the late 70s onward is that the world was rooting for it, right? And so the United States and other advanced democracies, they opened their markets, they transferred technology, they did lots of things to facilitate China's emergence as an economic great power. That is no longer the case, right? And so you've seen particularly advanced democracies try to wall off sectors of their economy from Chinese technology, 5G, for instance. China's confronting thousands of new tariff barriers over the last decade and so on and so forth. So the world is no longer so welcoming. That's one bucket. And then the second bucket would be kind of what I would call strategic encirclement. And this is what often happens to rising powers. They start behaving more assertively. They scare countries around them. They scare their rivals, and those rivals start working together to check their rise. And that's a very good description of what has been happening, albeit sometimes in slow motion, to China, really going back to 2009, 2010, but picking up speed and urgency over the past 5 years, and particularly since COVID. And so I'm happy to go into a lot more detail on this, but you can see, quasi-military coalitions that are coming together to check China's influence, like AUKUS. You can see multilateral efforts to slow down China's technological development. You can see a variety of other things. And so these are kind of the major weaknesses that China has. Just one word on the strengths. Yeah. The problem is that in a variety of areas, China has sort of a head start on its competitors, or it had a head start on its competitors. And so why did Huawei come so close to becoming the world's dominant 5G provider, including in Europe and the United Kingdom? Well, because the Chinese invested heavily in this at a time when the United States and other countries were basically asleep at the switch on the strategic implications of 5G. You can make a similar argument about the Chinese military buildup. This is a buildup that's been maturing over a number of years. And so basically China is reaching a position of strength because the buildup that it has undertaken and the reforms that it has undertaken to prepare itself for a major contingency in the Western Pacific will be more or less complete around the middle of this decade, whereas the U.S. defense program, the Japanese defense program, the Taiwanese defense program, these things are all optimized for a conflict occurring sometime in the early 2030s, right? And so there's going to be a period of time where China will have very pronounced military advantages in the region. So that would be a second category of strength.
All right. Okay. So a lot to chew on there. I want to turn to a couple specific aspects of your book's arguments, both on kind of China's intentions and your suggestions for the United States to counter. And one is what you different times call the democracy factor or the ideological factor, right? So on page 119, you say China has gone on the ideological offensive in recent years and taken its repression global. Beijing now spends billions of dollars annually on an anti-democratic toolkit of NGOs, media outlets, diplomats, all designed to prop up autocrats and sow discord in democracies. Then flipping a little later on page 170, you say, in terms of your prescriptions for American policy, you say rather provocatively, the immediate priority for the United States must be to blast holes in the digital iron curtain that Beijing is drawing around large swaths of the globe. So tell us more about, China's aversion to democracy, what animates that, because this is very different from the past, non-interference and internal affairs dogma, but also your advocacy of the United States instrumentalizing democracy, human rights promotion.
I should say at the outset here that we learned a lot and we drew a lot on the work of one of your colleagues in doing this, Professor Greitens, who's done wonderful work on the way that the CCP weaponizes technology in particular to strengthen the forces of repression in countries around the world. I think the place to start is that it is very difficult for a regime run by the Chinese Communist Party to ever feel comfortable in the existing international system, right? Because the existing international system is run by a democratic superpower, which has lots of allies, many of which are democracies, and those countries have ideas about human rights, about the way that the proper way of structuring a society and its relationship to the state that would quite literally be fatal to the CCP regime if they were ever to take hold within China. And so the way that the CCP has long looked at this is that sort of the norms of the international system that the United States has sought to create are actually quite dangerous to the preservation of autocratic rule within China. And this isn't just kind of an abstract concern, because the CCP can point to instances in which the United States and other democracies have ganged up on China and imposed economic sanctions on China because of the way that it handles its internal business, right? This was the case after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. It's the case today in response to the repression in Xinjiang. And so that's kind of the starting point. What has changed is that as countries become more powerful, they have greater ability to shape the world around them. And so we shouldn't be at all surprised that an increasingly powerful autocratic China seeks to shape a world that is at very least protective of autocracy, just in the same way that the United States has tried to fashion a world that will be protective of democracy. This is kind of international politics 101. Countries pursue foreign policies that are meant to make the world safe for their domestic systems. And this is exactly what China is doing today. And it's doing so in a variety of ways. It's not just suppressing free speech within China's borders. It's suppressing free speech about China around the world. And so I'll give you an example of this. In late 2020, the Australian government said that it supported internet calls for an international inquiry into the origins of COVID, right? How had the pandemic started, and how did it escape China and reach the world? And in response to that, the Chinese government slapped a ton of economic sanctions on Australia, right? No more Australian wine purchases, things of that nature, and gave a series of demands to the Australian government, basically saying, if you want to restore decent relations with China, do these things. I think there were 14 points, so maybe a little bit of unintended irony.
Very Wilsonian of them. We're all Wilsonians at the end of the day.
But a couple of those points basically amounted to the destruction of civil society in Australia, right? You've got to cancel think tanks and newspapers that put out anti-China propaganda, right? And so when you think about that for a minute, what the CCP is actually trying to do is censor free speech, which is perhaps the fundamental pillar of democracy within a democratic society, right? And you see lots of examples of this. Countries will regularly get sanctioned if an activist critiques the CCP's human rights practices or critiques Chinese foreign policy. And so we should just be very clear about what this is. This is sort of a policy of democracy suppression, of free speech suppression that reaches well beyond China's borders. We've seen other instances of this as well. China is one of the leading purveyors of what's sometimes called transnational repression. And so autocracies working with other regimes, often other autocracies, to track down, hound, and jail dissidents even beyond their borders. And there's a variety of other things that one could throw into the mix here.
I'm just recalling China's boycott of Norway for several years after the Nobel Peace Prize Committee gave the Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, the dissident. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, and so punishing entire countries for what even a non-governmental entity within that country will do. And so this is kind of how we need to think about the challenge. But part of that challenge is very much wrapped up in the dissemination of advanced technology, particularly surveillance technology, to countries around the world. And so Huawei, ZTE, other Chinese tech firms have been very involved in purveying so-called smart cities technologies to countries around the world, particularly in the developing world. And often, in many cases, what this has the effect of doing is entrenching the control of autocratic regimes, right? Giving them better surveillance capabilities than they would otherwise have. And so this is one of the reasons we make, what you pointed out was sort of the fairly provocative prescription of actually sort of going after this problem at the source. And so if we think that Hikvision and Huawei and a variety of other companies are involved in global efforts to entrench autocracy and suppress democracy, then it may be worth going after the problem at the source by making it harder for them to do the innovation that they're using to promote these projects.
All right. So another topic that you spend a lot of time on in the book is Taiwan, and of course this is again in the headlines quite a bit these days. Most recently with Speaker Pelosi's visit there, and China's military exercises in response. And as you and I were talking earlier last week in this very room, we hosted Professor Aaron Friedberg of Princeton, who also has a provocative new book on China out. And during the Q&A, we brought up the Taiwan question, and very particularly this ongoing debate: should the United States change its current policy of strategic ambiguity and instead extend a more explicit security commitment to Taiwan? So it's a kind of a declaratory policy debate. And on page 178, you say this, or you and your co-author Mike Beckley say this: even the strongest red line declarations will amount to cheap talk if not backed by a stronger defense, something the United States and Taiwan currently lack. So tell us more about you can talk about the declaratory policy debate if you want, but tell us more about your actual, on the ground, in implementation defense policy recommendations quite urgently for the U.S. and Taiwan.
I think it actually would be useful to talk a little bit about the declaratory policy debate, in part just because it's been in the news, because President Biden keeps changing the policy and denying that he has changed the policy. He's done it 4 times now. But the United States has typically avoided making clear-cut pronouncements about what it would do to help Taiwan in a major security crisis, in part because it has long viewed its task in the Taiwan Strait as dual deterrence, right? Deterrence that works both ways, right? And so you want to deter from using force to resolve the Taiwan issue, but you also want to deter Taiwan from doing potentially destabilizing things like declaring independence, for instance. And so the idea was that you wanted to create uncertainty in everybody's mind about how the United States would respond if a major security crisis arose. That debate, I think, has shifted in recent years because, whereas you could make the argument, during the time when you were in government, thinking about these issues, that Taiwan was actually destabilizing the status quo by talking about referendums on questions related to independence and that sort of thing.
Yeah, we did have some of those issues. For our listeners, this is way back in the George W. Bush administration, so ancient history. But
the Bush administration came down pretty hard on Taiwan when that happened.
Yeah.
Now, clearly the source of instability is that you have dramatically increasing PRC capabilities and dramatically increasing PRC coercion, military and otherwise, of Taiwan. And so this along with warnings from a variety of high-ranking U.S. officials, including the former commander of Indo-Pacific Command and the director of national intelligence, has led a number of folks to argue that the United States needs to move from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity, right? To giving a sort of very firm statement that if China attacked Taiwan, the United States would come to Taiwan's defense, which would turn the relationship into something closer to an alliance, although not quite an alliance, because we still don't have nearly the degree of sort of military interaction or interoperability with Taiwan that we would with, say, a Germany or Japan.
And it wouldn't obligate Taiwan to come to our defense if we're attacked.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
It's a one-way guarantee.
Yeah, that's right.
Kind of, right?
Hey, we welcome all the help we could get. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I think the reason this is an interesting debate is that it actually shows that there is a lot of debate and diversity within what you might kind of crudely call the China hawk community, right? And so there are lots of people who think that the United States should help Taiwan defend itself from a Chinese attack. And those people don't all agree on the answer to this question, right? And so there are some folks who would say it is critical that you not create any uncertainty in Xi Jinping's mind about whether the United States would respond, because that might lead him to take a gamble that he would then later regret. But unfortunately, by the time he regrets it, you're in a major war in the Western Pacific. And then there are folks, and I'd put myself in this category, who are a little bit more ambivalent about a move towards strategic clarity for one of 2 reasons. And the first reason might be that this would be perceived by China as a major change in the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And so if you had a China that was looking for a pretext to cause an even bigger security crisis in the Strait, this would be as good a pretext as you're gonna serve up, right? And so there are some folks who would argue, and I think my colleague at AEI, Zach Cooper, in this category, who basically say, don't do this until you are ready for a fight with China over Taiwan, because you may actually provoke what you're trying to avoid. And then there's the second argument, and I think this is kind of more where I place myself, which is that the debate may just kind of be beside the point, right? And so I think it is likely, if not certain, that the PLA already plans on having to contend with the United States in any Taiwan conflict. There are things they might do to try to make U.S. intervention less likely, but that any prudent planner would have to take this into account, particularly after all the things that President Biden has said in recent months. And so the real question is not a capability. It's not a commitment question. It's not a resolve question. It's a capabilities question. And it doesn't matter if China thinks that you are willing to defend Taiwan if they don't think that you are able to defend Taiwan. And I think that is the position that we are sliding into right now, that the military balance has changed so fundamentally that China might think that it could actually defeat the United States, even if the United States joined the fighting. And so to get back to the question you asked, how do you prevent this? And basically, I think you need a much more determined and urgent effort to turn the geography of the region to our advantage, right? So the good news is that Taiwan is actually a pretty defensible place if Taiwan and the United States and other countries take the right steps. It's separated by some pretty choppy water, about 100 miles worth from the mainland. It's always been difficult to project large amounts of power over water in a contested amphibious crossing. So we're looking at an amphibious assault that could be on par or even greater than the Normandy invasion in 1944. That's difficult to do. There aren't that many beaches you can land on the western side of Taiwan. And Taiwan's geography is really favorable to defense in a lot of respects. It's got jungles, it's got mountains, it's got big cities, right? None of these things are ideal for sort of maneuver warfare. And so if Taiwan can turn itself into a strategic porcupine by loading up on drones and anti-ship missiles and attritable ISR and sea mines and ground-based fires and things like that, it can make an invasion really, really costly and really unappealing for Xi Jinping and the PLA. The United States needs to be investing in similar things. Lots of long-range strike, right? Lots of submarine-based capabilities. Lots of things that can basically turn the Taiwan Strait into a shooting gallery. And then there are other pieces of it as well, right? And so the more that China has to fear that an attack on Taiwan leads not to a small local war, but to a big regional war involving not just Taiwan, not just the United States, but let's say Japan, Australia, other countries, the more daunting a prospect that is. And so there are steps we can be taking to tighten our cooperation with those countries as well. And so if you put all of those things together, the hope is that even a more risk-acceptant Xi Jinping looks at it and says, nope, this is just too much risk for me. I'm not going to do it because I worry that this could lead to the end of China's rejuvenation. It could lead to the end of the regime. It could lead, to the end of Xi Jinping.
Mm-hmm. All right. So two more questions from me, and then we're going to turn to audience questions. So be thinking of thoughtful questions, audience. First, as you mentioned last night, as you and Mike Beckley were nearing the completion of the writing of this book, Vladimir Putin decided to complicate your writing by invading Ukraine. So tell us not so much about how you had to add some tweaks there, but how does Russia's invasion of Ukraine 7 months ago and the subsequent 7 months of combat, Ukrainian counteroffensive, how does that affect your analysis in this book?
Well, you'll be shocked to hear that it totally confirmed everything we thought prior to the war. No, but so I think we are still trying to figure out, and we won't know for some time, what the full implications of the Ukraine war are for global security and the Western Pacific. I can offer a handful of preliminary observations on this. And so one, I think the Ukraine war probably has done a service for the United States and its allies in the Western Pacific by providing a much more graphic demonstration of what we talk about in the book than we ever could have done, which is that the danger of aggressive autocratic military moves, of conquest, of atrocity on a large scale is very real, right? This is not something that we're just making up. This is something that's happening in the world right now. And so if it can happen in Eastern Europe, it can happen in the Western Pacific. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think the war created a window of opportunity because of the first dynamic for the United States and Taiwan and other countries to get far more serious and urgent about their defense than they had been before. And so one of the things that the war has revealed, for instance, is just how rapidly the United States would run out of advanced munitions in a major conflict with a Russia or a China, right? We just don't have the magazine depth that we would need for a conflict of this sort. And so it's created greater awareness of that problem. And now the question is, how quickly will the United States move to address that problem? From Taiwan's perspective, I mean, I think the war has been a wonderful demonstration of how effective what you might call whole of society resistance can be, right? And so in Ukraine, it's not just sort of the regular military that has been resisting. It's territorial defense forces. It's folks who hadn't held a gun 2 months before the war started. It's people who are gathering, ordinary civilians who are gathering intelligence on Russian positions from behind enemy lines, so the Ukrainians can call in artillery strikes and things of that nature. And that's actually a pretty promising model. If you have a really committed defender with very advantageous terrain, you can make conquest very, very difficult. Taiwan is way behind the curve on all of these things, by the way. But at least I think it's created a roadmap for Taiwan as it gets more serious about these issues. And then I think the final question is, like, what does the war in Ukraine do to Xi Jinping's calculus about whether attacking Taiwan is a good idea or not? And I think the answer is complicated. I think part of the answer is that we don't know, because it's really hard to get inside Xi Jinping's head, and the Chinese system has just become so much more opaque than it was even a decade ago. And another part of the answer, kind of a caveat, is that when Xi Jinping makes a decision to attack or not attack Taiwan, it's primarily going to have to do with factors that don't have a ton to do with Ukraine, right? Ukraine will matter, but at the margin. So how will Ukraine matter at the margin? I think there are kind of two theories about this right now. The first theory is that the Ukraine war will make Xi Jinping far more cautious in going after Taiwan, because he has seen how difficult conquest is against a committed defense. He's seen how good U.S. intelligence capabilities are, which probably makes him nervous about how much strategic surprise China would have in a conflict. He has seen all the problems within another autocratic military, Putin's military. And so surely this makes him a bit more cautious about doing something so risky. That's one theory. The second theory kind of runs like this. First, Xi Jinping does not believe that the United States would do to China half of what it has done to Russia. He does not believe, for instance, that the United States and other countries would sanction China's central bank, because China's central bank is so much more important to the functioning of the global economy than Russia's is. He doesn't believe that the Ukraine war has a lot of implications for thinking about Taiwanese resistance, because he just doesn't have a lot of respect for Taiwan's capacity and will to resist in the first place. And he may believe that what the war in Ukraine shows is that if you have nuclear weapons, the United States won't intervene directly against you, right? And so is that a correct interpretation of the Ukraine war? I don't know. I think the Biden administration would have been hesitant to intervene directly, even if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons. But Xi Jinping could still take that lesson away from it. And so the lesson he could draw, according to this scenario, is it's not a don't invade Taiwan lesson. It's a, if you're going to invade Taiwan, do it decisively. Don't do it in sort of the ham-handed, halfway manner that Putin tried to invade Ukraine. I can't really tell you which of these interpretations is closer to truth, because we're all guessing a little bit. But if I had to make an educated guess, I would say that the second one is at least as plausible as the first.
All right. So, final question from me before we turn to the audience. So this has to do with how the book's been received, right? So it's been out for is it about 6 weeks now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I want to know, how has it been received in two capitals in particular? One, Washington. I know there's been some buzz there in Washington. You intended this as something of a wake-up call for some people in Washington. And then second, how's it been received in Beijing? Any speaking invites from Xi Jinping yet to come have a polite discourse and vigorous exchange of views? So, yeah.
No, but Global Times and Xinhua have taken an interest in the book.
Those are two official Chinese newspapers. So.
Yeah, and so they don't like the peaking power thesis. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
And so there has been a little bit of pushback from Beijing on this. Beckley and I were summoned to meet with Chinese diplomatic officials at at some point. We haven't taken them up on that offer yet.
Just make sure they pay for lunch. So, okay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Meet in a public place, right? And so,
and bring an undergrad along as a taster. Yeah, so, okay. Sorry for any undergrads here.
So that is that's the view from Beijing.
Yeah.
In Washington, I think there's a really interesting debate around these issues, and so if you want to go deeper in this and kind of get the abridged bibliography on who thinks what about the China challenge, there was a really interesting article written in The Economist maybe about a month ago that mentioned our book, but then mentioned contributions by a variety of other very smart China watchers in DC and elsewhere. And I think there is real analytical debate, not just among kind of the think tank community, but I think within the U.S. government as well, about a variety of questions that pertain to the book. And so one is, yes, I think most people agree at this point that China has real economic problems, but how solvable are those problems? And so skeptics of our argument would say, look, there's a lot of stuff that China could do, internal immigration reform and things like that would actually ease some of the economic problems that they face. Our answer would be, yes, but they're not gonna do that because that would contradict sort of the imperatives of the political system as Xi Jinping sees it. I think there is a debate over whether China faces more kind of grinding stagnation or a more acute economic crisis at some point this decade. I think there is debate over when the threat to Taiwan in particular becomes most severe. This is obviously a question that the U.S. government, I think, has thought a lot about over the last year or two. What's interesting is that I think there is real cognitive dissonance within the U.S. government on this issue. And so, I could point you to 6 or 7 statements by high-ranking U.S. officials saying, implicitly, this is a this decade problem. This is not a 2035 problem. The most DOD will say at this point publicly is that they don't expect China to invade within the next 2 years, right? But if you look at the U.S. defense program, it's not oriented toward a major security crisis in the Western Pacific in 2025 or 2027. It's still oriented toward a major crisis in 2032 or 2035, right? We're still loading up on R&D money as opposed to procurement money, for instance, which indicates that you think you have more time until you really need the most relevant capabilities.
Those are the people who read your last book, but not the current book. That's right.
So I guess the way I would frame this is, look, I obviously have a dog in this fight, and so it's hard for me to kind of adjudicate these disputes. But this is a hard analytical problem, right? It's a hard analytical problem to make sense of what China's economic trajectory will mean for China's behavior. It is a hard analytical problem to know what may or may not push Xi Jinping to adopt a more forward-leaning policy vis-a-vis Taiwan, in part because, even if we're right about the trends in this book, or even if our critics are right about the trends that they identify, what provokes the crisis may be something that none of us see coming, right? And so we look back and we say, look, in the summer of 1914, Germany was clearly a peaking power with strong incentives to go sooner rather than later. But absent, sort of an assassin getting lucky and killing an Austrian archduke, right?
Ferdinand. Yeah.
You don't get the crisis that brings on the war in the first place. Absent Nancy Pelosi deciding to go to Taiwan in August 2022, you don't get the crisis that we had last month. I mean, maybe it comes along 3 months later or something like that, or 6 months later when Speaker McCarthy decides to go, right? But
or the Dalai Lama visits Taipei.
There's always a catalytic event, or there's often a catalytic event, I should say. And so that makes the analytical problem even harder. And so I think what we're trying to accomplish in the book is not make a point prediction that, on this day, this thing's going to happen. Yes, we do that in the introduction, right? But it's for purposes of illustration. What we want to do is convince people that the problem is more urgent than they think, and we have less time, generally speaking, than we may believe.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.